The plane full of babies in cardboard boxes. April 4, 1975. Saigon. 10 miles outside the city, North Vietnamese tanks were rolling closer by the hour. Inside Saigon, the streets were choking with panic, families burning documents, soldiers deserting their posts, the sound of distant artillery rattling windows that hadn't been washed in weeks. The Republic of Vietnam had, at most, weeks left to live. In Washington, President Gerald Ford had already made a decision that would either be remembered as an act of mercy or a reckless gamble: get the orphans out. Thousands of Vietnamese children, many of them fathered by American servicemen, many with nowhere else to go, were about to become the most vulnerable casualties of a collapsing war. Ford called it Operation Babylift. The goal: airlift more than 3,300 children out of Vietnam before the country disappeared beneath them. There was no time to build the operation properly. There was no time for anything, really. So when the largest aircraft in the world, a U.S. Air Force C-5A Galaxy, a plane designed to haul tanks and armored vehicles, not infants, was rolled out onto the tarmac at Tan Son Nhut Air Base, the ground crews did the only thing they could. They improvised. A cargo hold full of cardboard. There were no cribs. There was no time to get any. So nurses and volunteers grabbed empty cardboard boxes from the base exchange, the kind meant for shipping supplies, not children, and turned them into bassinets. 2, sometimes 3 infants were laid into each box. The boxes were then lined up in rows across the cavernous belly of the aircraft and lashed to the floor with cargo netting, the same netting normally used to secure tanks. By the time the doors closed, 314 people were aboard. Some accounts say closer to 328. Of them, 243 to 250 were children, many of them under a year old. Many were sick. Many were malnourished. Some had never been held by a stranger before that morning, and now they were being strapped into a war machine bound for a country they would never remember leaving. The lower deck of the C-5A, designed for cargo, not passengers, was where most of the children were packed. The upper deck held the rest, along with the flight crew and nearly 3 dozen women from the U.S. Defense Attaché Office who had volunteered to fly as escorts, some of them barely more than girls themselves. At 4:15 p.m., the giant plane thundered down the runway and lifted off from Tan Son Nhut, climbing away from a city that was already dying. 12 minutes. For 12 minutes, it must have felt almost peaceful. 12 minutes of climbing altitude, of leaving the war behind, of cardboard boxes rocking gently with the hum of 4 enormous engines. 12 minutes of believing the hardest part was over. It wasn't. At roughly 23,000 feet, over the South China Sea near Vung Tau, the locks on the rear cargo door, the massive ramp built to swallow armored vehicles, failed. In an instant, the door blew outward with explosive force. The cabin decompressed violently. The air itself seemed to detonate, and in the chaos that followed, a whirlwind of fog and debris tore through the fuselage. The blast didn't just rip the door away. It severed the control cables running to the tail of the aircraft, the very nerves the pilots needed to steer. 2 of the plane's 4 hydraulic systems failed instantly. The rudder was gone. The elevator was gone. What remained to the crew was almost nothing: a single aileron, the spoilers, and raw engine power. A plane the size of a football field, carrying more than 200 children, was now barely more than a glider with no way to steer and no way to slow its descent cleanly. In the rear of the lower deck, the section closest to the door, the decompression was catastrophic. 2 flight attendants and dozens of the babies strapped into their cardboard boxes were pulled out of the aircraft in the initial blast, lost instantly over the sea below. I undid my lap belt, fell to the ceiling. At the controls sat Captain Dennis Butt Traynor, with his co-pilot beside him. In the space of a few seconds, Traynor had gone from commanding the world's largest aircraft to fighting a machine that no longer wanted to fly. Turning back to Tan Son Nhut was out of the question. The descent was too steep, too fast, too uncontrolled to risk threading back into a runway approach over a war zone. Instead, Traynor aimed the crippled Galaxy toward the only flat ground he could find, a rice paddy short of the base. He had almost nothing to work with: no rudder, no elevator, a plane that wanted to yaw and roll on its own, and hundreds of lives depending on how well he could improvise a landing with what little control remained. The aircraft hit hard. It skidded, briefly became airborne again, crossed the Saigon River, and slammed into a dike. The impact tore the fuselage into 4 separate pieces, scattering wreckage, wiring, and cargo netting across the marsh. When it was over, 138 people were dead. It remains the deadliest single accident in the history of the C-5 Galaxy, and one of the worst non-combat disasters in U.S. military aviation history. And yet astonishingly 176 people survived. Most of them were on the upper deck, spared the worst of the initial blast. Rescuers pulling apart the wreckage found something that seemed almost impossible: babies, still alive, still strapped inside their cardboard boxes, which had absorbed just enough of the impact to save them. Traynor himself later described the moment the plane finally stopped moving. He unbuckled his lap belt, fell toward the ceiling of the crumpled cockpit, forced open a side window, and climbed out to see the wings already burning behind him. The second flight. Word of the crash reached the base within hours. Every nurse and volunteer scheduled for the next Babylift flight now knew exactly what had happened to the first one. They knew about the cardboard boxes. They knew about the door. They knew about the babies who never made it out of the South China Sea. They boarded anyway. The photograph so many people have seen: rows of infants in cardboard boxes, nurses crouched beside them, cargo netting stretched overhead, usually isn't from the flight that crashed. It's from the second successful mission, flown a day later by crews who understood the risk better than anyone alive and chose to fly into it regardless. Over the following weeks, thousands more children would be airlifted out under Operation Babylift, carried by people who had watched the first flight survivors come out of a rice paddy and decided the mission still had to continue. 30 years later. For decades, many of the surviving children grew up in the United States with only fragments of their own story: a document, a date, a name on an adoption file. Some didn't learn until they were adults that the flight that carried them out of Vietnam was the one that had gone down in a rice paddy, or that the friends who had been in the boxes beside them never made it home. One of those survivors was Aryn Lockhart. She was 2 months old, strapped into a cardboard box in the back of that C-5A, when the door blew off 23,000 feet above the sea. She lived. Today, decades later, she is a mother, living an ordinary life in Ohio. One more quiet ending to a story that, for 12 minutes over the South China Sea, came terrifyingly close to having none at all.